we heard last month from several people who said, could we dial back the detail of the programming just a little bit? And we remembered, yeah, that's right. Half of the membership of this club at any given point has been in the club for less than a year. And so we need to be reminded that, hey, every once in a while, let's remind each other about the basics of what we're talking about and be able to ask all sorts of basic questions of each other about what we're seeing in the woods and why it's there and how it works. And really, there's not many people better placed to talk at that level to us all than Aaron, who has been putting together Mushroom Wonderland for about 4 years now and drawing a huge following, just talking about the basics in the woods. So, without further ado, take it away, sir.
Thanks, David. All right, I don't just talk about the basics either. Let's get that clear. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I have the honor of teaching some really introductory mycology classes in this very room for Olympic College, and there'll be a new set of classes in the spring. So this talk is like a 1-hour adaptation of the first part of the little mycology course. So basically just familiarizing ourselves with mushrooms, and not just mushrooms, but fungus in general, and hopefully you get a better idea of exactly how this works, and hopefully there's even some facts and stuff in here that people who know a little bit might be surprised about. So we'll just get going. And maybe not. Okay, who am I? My name is Aaron Hilliard. I was the vice president of this club for 3 years, and Larry just took over. And but I started Mushroom Wonderland on YouTube. I teach these classes here. I've been foraging and interested in mushrooms since I was a little kid, when my grandma got me into it. And so now I like to just travel around and mushroom and learn and teach and make videos. So we're just going to get right into it. So what is a mushroom? A mushroom is a fruiting body of a fungus. A fruiting body is a term specific to fungal reproductive structures. So a fruiting body is different from a fruit. It's kind of more of a factory. So an apple, when it's growing on the tree, it has a defined number of seeds in it. And when it falls off the tree, it has the same amount of seeds. But a mushroom actually produces spores, which are kind of like fungal seeds, and it just keeps producing them. So it's more of a factory. If an apple kept shedding seeds off of it, we'd probably call that a fruiting body. There are lots of types of quote-unquote mushrooms. So let's take a look at some, because that term is so vague, the word mushroom. But, even kids can look at all these different shapes and say, that's a mushroom, that's a mushroom. And so there's a lot of different shapes. This one, Agaricus abrupta bulbus, that was found in Banner Forest a couple years ago. Beautiful, edible Agaricus. These are honey mushrooms in the genus Armillaria. Pretty crazy looking mushrooms, can be parasitic and kill trees. Boletes, these ones are still called mushrooms, but if you look, they don't have like gills. So, let me bring out my big, huge mushroom learning tool here. This is my huge mushroom. And if you look underneath here, it's got gills, right? So that's kind of like the typical mushroom look, has got gills, but we call that a mushroom too, and it has a sponge underneath there. So those are kind of generically called boletes. Oh, I better not block the zoomers. Chanterelles, also called mushrooms, but a different morphology still, with what appear to be gills, and technically they are gills. They produce spores on that surface, on that hymenium surface right here, but not exactly like sheets of paper that would come off of something like this. Where'd it go? There's a gill that I can pull out. That's like, that's a regular gill is kind of like a little slit of paper, whereas these are kind of etched into the stem. Some people call them false gills or veins even. Tree conch, we call that a mushroom, but it looks way different. It doesn't have gills on it. Some of them do. But these often are hard and woody and grow on the side of trees and can persist for months or even years. Still recognized as mushrooms. These are considered mushrooms, this orange jelly fungus that you see on logs out in the forest, especially this time of year. If you're into nature walking, it's really bright and it stands out against this drab forest scape that we have going on right now. And you see a lot of this orange jelly, but we still call it a mushroom, I guess. Cup fungus. These are like in the Pezziziales, these weird cups, you know, people would still recognize them as mushrooms. This is still considered a mushroom. It's a bird nest fungi in the nidula. So these ones have these little things called peridioles that produce spores inside of this little cup, and when a raindrop falls down, it splashes these little peridioles out, and then the spores shoot off of those, and often they're very sticky. And
How big are those things?
So this is about maybe 3/8 of an inch across, you know, about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch across, very small. But they're really common, and they like winter too. They're one of the only things you're going to see out there this time of year, growing on little sticks laying in the debris underneath the conifer forests around here. This is a weird type of mushroom in the gastrales. These ones are earth stars. One of the only self-plucking mushrooms. It has this sheath that curls down around it, and as it matures, it actually plucks itself off of the ground and can kind of become a tumbleweed, you know, blow down the trail and stuff as it's expelling spores everywhere. This one, I don't know if you'd call it a mushroom, but you might see this time of year. It's called hair ice, and it grows on sticks and stumps, and it's thought to be caused by this Exidiopsis fungus that was described somewhat theoretically from Europe, but there's no evidence of it existing here, and some people are, right now, they're looking into it, and like Adolf Zeska basically just said there's no fungus involved in this. So I don't know, but kind of a cool thing. This is blue-green elf cups. These are a type of mushroom, and they stain the wood blue-green. You can find these in the winter right now. This is a great time to hunt for what we call chlorocyboria, and people make trinkets out of it. For hundreds of years, they've been making jewelry and trinkets, putting it into woodwork. I have a friend who's a woodworker. He wants to make one of these fancy live-edge tables, and we're going to put the blue-green bow ties in it from the chlorocyboria. Really cool. These are a type of mushroom, even though they don't look like a typical mushroom. These are morels, some of the most highly sought after edible mushrooms in the world, and they're delicious. And those are on the horizon. We're just a couple months away, and we might start seeing these popping up. So that's always exciting. So there's two main types of fungi. We have what's called basidiomycetes, and these are big words, but don't be scared. Basidiomycete, and these are the type that have, most of them that have gills, those little jelly funguses and stuff, basidiomycetes, because they grow their spores on something called a basidia. So basically basidiomycetes grow their spores, and the spores kind of just fall off. Whereas an ascomycete is a totally different kind of texture. You can see that, you know, morels just feel and look different, and those cup fungus that you see growing on like old, on the edges of driveways or old like a pile of cardboard you might have had. A lot of times these ascos come up, and they actually eject their spores out of something called asci. So we have basidia is where these spores are produced, and asci is where those spores are produced. And so that's the main difference between these two main divisions of kingdom fungi. So a mushroom is just a part of the fungi. So a fruiting body, or the mushroom, is just part of the entire fungus, which is usually unseen. Usually you don't see the actual organism. We live on top of the soil or the wood or whatever, and the fungus or the organism actually lives within the substrate, so the soil or the wood. And so we just see the evidence of them when it's time for sexual reproduction to take place. That's when they produce a fruiting body. And so you can kind of think of it, if you want to think of it as in a plant way, you know, an apple tree will grow and then produce fruit once a year. And a lot of fungus is the same. They grow underground. Imagine a big tree underground, and then it produces fruiting bodies once a year. And that's kind of how we have chanterelles. But often there'll be several flushes, but they like to fruit at the specific time of the year every year. So the second largest organism in the world is a fungi. It is the mycelium of an armillaria, a honey mushroom in eastern Oregon, and you can't see it. You know, this is a huge 2,400 acre organism that's just growing just an inch underneath the top of the soil, and it's crawling through everything and through the wood. And it was for a long time called the biggest organism on Earth and the oldest, but it got nudged out by an Australian seagrass. So that's disappointing. Nobody likes seagrass. So For a long time, mushrooms were thought of as plants. Actually, I have some literature from like the 1960s and they're still calling them plants, you know. Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, he included them in his kingdom of plants, but he did notice that there were some things different about them for sure. They just didn't pay a lot of attention to them until around probably the 1700s. So fungi are actually closer to humans and animals than they are to plants. So here's the eukaryotic tree of life. We have Animalia, Plantae, fungi is its own thing. That didn't happen until like the 1980s. But over here you have humans, animals, and fungi. We all breathe oxygen, and we eat to get our calories. We eat fat and sugar. And so does fungi. And then plants get most of their energy through photosynthesis, and they mainly breathe carbon dioxide. So quite different. And in that way, we're actually closer to kingdom fungi. So fungi are always in contact with their environment. So there is no outer skin, or there's no barrier to protect the inside of it. There is no inside either, you know. And so a lot of people in that argument, the old argument of should you cut or pluck a mushroom, sometimes the argument is made, well, if you cut it, that's going to be a hole to introduce things to get inside the fungus. But it's like the fungus is touching everything all the time. It's in constant contact with its environment. So there really is no inside. If it encounters something, it creates enzymes to combat it. And so fungi is really competitive that way. It fights to stay alive, and it'll fight other fungi. And the body of that fungi is called the mycelium. That is the vegetative part of the fungus, consisting of a network of fine white filaments called hyphae. So little tiny strands, just one cell built against the next. You cannot see a strand of hyphae with your eye. In fact, it would take 6,000 strands of them laid side by side to make a quarter inch. So that's how small they are. They're very, very small. So hyphae, I just pretty much said all this. They combine together. When enough of them get together, you can start to see a strand of mycelium. And when a lot of those strands come together, they can form rhizomorphs. So like Armillaria is known for having rhizomorphic mycelium, really thick, ropey strands of this white filamentous material. And that is thousands and thousands and thousands of strands of mycelium that have came together. And so it would take 6,000 strands to equal a quarter inch. I was doing that math today. That's pretty crazy. So the hyphae make up the mycelium. You got all these little tiny strands, and then at the tip of each of the hyphae, where number 11 is over there, is a specialized organelle called the Spitzenkorper. Kind of a weird name. Sounds like a made-up name, right? Well, it is, but not by me. But it assists in the formation of new cell wall and membrane structures, and it decides which enzymes to use to move through its substrate. So this is a small, super intelligent little organ on the tip of every strand of hyphae that is going through the substrate. It's detecting what's in front of it, and then it's on the fly. It's creating enzymes, and the fungus is exuding enzymes to help sanitize and to help break things down to eat it. So this little tiny organ on the tip of the hyphae is super intelligent, super smart. It can figure out how to synthesize chemicals on the fly as it's moving. And, sometimes it synthesizes something like what penicillin has revolutionized, human antibiotics in its attempt to sanitize its environment. So fungi is really intelligent, but it doesn't seem to have a brain. 1 cubic inch of soil can hold up to 8 miles of hyphae. So if you just took these little strands and you laid them end to end, that is a lot of hyphae. It can fit in a very, very small place. So fungi, it rides a beat of chemicals. Basically, it rides a beat of chemicals wherever it goes, sanitizing and preparing the way. So at the very tip, you have the Spitzenkorper. These are all different fungal cells linked one after another. That's a strand of hyphae. And then it's creating these little enzymes to kill the bad guys. And I did make that drawing, so you're welcome. Some of my custom artwork.
Refrigerator artwork.
So there is no central part of a fungus. If you think about it, like we have a brain and a heart, you can tell kind of where the center is and where we're getting operated from. But a fungus, there doesn't appear to be any central part. There is no brain, yet it's pretty intelligent, which is really baffling. Like how does this thing that's very much sentient, it can move, it can crawl through its substrate, it can make decisions, it can make choices, but it doesn't seem to have any brain. So it can direct itself toward its food source. This is interesting. So when it travels out in search of food, fungi will start in the center and it works its way out in all directions. And when it encounters a food source, it can somehow communicate with itself to come over this way, to go to the food. So this was an experiment where a piece of agar was laid down on a sugar-rich substrate. This fungus started to grow in all directions, going out here into the sides, and then it encountered that block of wood up there. And so all of its strength redirected. It somehow told itself over here, stop going that way, come over here. And so it focused on the wood block. You can see how it all is going in that one direction. Really pretty fascinating how it can figure out how to talk to itself. And so there's some theories that suggest that it acts like the car's hydraulic braking system. And it senses slight pressure changes and somehow can interpret those signals to take action. And so, if you know anything about a car's brake system, it's very delicate and just a small amount of movement over here will affect it over here. And so perhaps it's making little tiny minuscule changes in water pressure through the cells and able to communicate with itself that way, which is really hard to believe when you understand like how the septa works, between how fluid could even pass from cell to cell. Is mind-blowing. So another research study suggests fungi use electrical impulses to communicate with itself using a type of speech that's similar to human language with up to 50 quote-unquote words that it talks to itself with. You can find that on the Royal Society Open Science page. So like many other organisms, fungi sense and respond to different types of stimuli like light, chemicals, touch. But their relation to sound is a relatively new discovery. So this guy, Noah Kalos, a mycologist based in North Carolina, he started hooking up synthesizers. This is a big pink oyster mushroom. He's got this crazy synthesizer. And then the electrical impulses in the mushrooms are actually creating this type of quote-unquote music, if you want to call it that. It's just like a bunch of different squelchy noises. And he's not the only one. There's a lot of people who are doing this now. Welcome, you guys. And so fungi also lack eyes. They don't seem to have a nervous system, yet they manage to know how not to eat themselves. Like I mentioned before, fungi is in competition with everything around it. It's constantly trying to fight for survival, and it can travel through substrate, but when it encounters itself again, rather than trying to fight against itself, it's self-aware, And so how does it do that? That's just crazy, right? They can also sense gravity and correct themselves to grow upward. It's called negative geotropism. So amanitas are good at doing this, where if the mushroom gets cocked over sideways, it'll straighten its cap out to keep its gills facing straight down. And so in a way, a mushroom really is kind of like an umbrella, because the gills, you want them to stay dry to keep producing spores on their basidia, and the spores fall out right here. See that? It worked. And so, if this gets turned over and this gets soaked, it's done. It's not producing spores anymore on this type of mushroom. So it actually works like an umbrella, and the water just sheds off of it. And some mushrooms actually get concave and seem to collect water. And I have theories about why it might do that. Maybe it's utilizing the water that's collecting from the top of its cap. I've talked to people about that. It's interesting. But there's a lot of different shapes and morphologies of mushrooms. Here's a couple of golden chanterelles pushing up early in the fall, and they were very strong and pushing right through the duff and correcting themselves on the way up. So turgor pressure, it's kind of an interesting concept. It's the force within a cell that pushes plasma against the cell wall. So combined with chitin, this is what gives fungi its rigidity. That's what makes a mushroom stand up, is water pressure within the cells. And so it enables plants to stand up. If you don't water a plant enough, it loses its turgor and it starts to droop. And humans will do that too. But, it also, that turgor pressure can allow fungi to blast through cement. And if you look over here, there's an agaricus, and down below a shaggy mane. They're known to blast right through asphalt, which is crazy because it's a pretty delicate mushroom. But you have such an immense rush of water pressure against the cell walls, and they can actually blast through the cement. There's like a cool old story about these people building a cobblestone road in ancient England, and they were impressed. They had built this beautiful road, and they went to bed, and then came out the next morning, and this huge flush of agaricus had popped up and flipped all their stones over, and undid all their work. You can read about it online. It's kind of cool. This is an interesting one, talking about turgor pressure. This one is the Pilobolus. So this is known as the dung cannon or the hat thrower, and it's a fungus. It grows on mainly horse dung, and so it's a coprophilic fungi. That means that it grows on poop, and most grazing animals don't want to eat things off of poop. So it's adapted a way to be able to eject itself away from the poo and to land on grass that might be eaten by the horses. So these little tiny 2-centimeter fruit bodies, they use this turgor pressure to throw their sporangium, so those little black things on the tip. It's kind of like those peridioles in the bird nest fungi, and they produce the spores on those little black things. And they can shoot them 6 feet away at a rate of more than 50 miles an hour. But I saw a video on the internet where they put a shotgun next to the Pilobolus, and the initial blast of the Pilobolus was faster than a shotgun, which is crazy. So that's a lot of water pressure. So if you ever see me looking around your horse poo pile, that's what I'm looking for. Whenever somebody's like, I got horses, I'm like, do they poop? Can I go look? So chitin, I mentioned that. It's a sugar molecule that's found in the exoskeleton of shellfish, like lobsters, crabs. It's in insects, and it's in fungi. So it makes it tough for us to digest. We really can't break this stuff down. It starts to break down at 250 degrees Celsius, so that's 482 degrees Fahrenheit, and it fully breaks down at 750 degrees Fahrenheit. You can't overcook mushrooms. Nobody's ever been like, that mushroom was overcooked. Like, you could just sit and you could burn one, I guess, if you carbonize it, but there's no such thing as too well done. And a lot of people really, push this idea, you got to break down the chitin, you got to cook it to break down the chitin. But there's no way that you're getting to 752 degrees with whatever you're cooking. It's not breaking the chitin down all the way. So I've asked some people, and I asked Dr. Bug, I visited him last fall, and I said, so what's this, man? It's like, there's no way that you're breaking down the chitin. What's this talk? And in his mind, he's like, I don't think you need to break down the chitin. You can still get things out of it. So, it's an interesting topic, and I'd like to learn more about it, but there's just sort of limited stuff online. So fungi digest their food outside of their body. We have a digestive system with enzymes in our stomach. We eat our food, it goes down, and it melts in our enzymes, and we absorb it through the stomach lining wall into our bloodstream, and it goes everywhere in our body. But fungi is a little bit different. So imagine this guy is a mushroom. He sits down to eat, and he gets his cheeseburger. He's going to throw up these enzymes onto his cheeseburger, and then he's going to absorb it through his arm. That's kind of how fungi eat. It's kind of a funny illustration. So there's 3 main types, living types of fungi. So there's saprobic, and there's mycorrhizal, and there's parasitic. So you'll often hear mushrooms. Is it mycorrhizal? And we're going to talk quite a bit about that. First, we'll start with saprobic. So saprobes, they eat decaying matter, kind of like the entoloma that Sean was talking about. They don't require a plant to live with or any kind of a host, and for that they're called free living, and they can just live on decaying matter, but in that way they're a little bit more tough to predict. If you're into wild foraging, it's kind of hard to predict saprobic mushrooms. They do like decay, they like specific decaying material. So like hygrosabe, some of the wax caps that you can find in the wintertime, they're saprobic. Most of them are saprobic. The genus hygrosabe is anyways. But, they often grow under red cedar and big leaf maple. So those kind of forests, those 2 trees often grow together in a similar habitat. And that same kind of decay happens year after year after year. So they're somewhat predictable because you can go to that habitat. But like The mycorrhizal, the ones that grow with the trees, a bit more predictable. We know that, if you're going to find chanterelles, you're not going to find them in the middle of a meadow. They're going to be under a specific kind of tree. So these are a couple of types of decay. So if you've ever been walking in the forest and you see a log that's crumbling apart and it's got this cubical brown kind of deteriorated wood. If you look at that picture on the right, it's a good example of how it's kind of cubical, and sometimes it looks almost like they're little cubes that are stacked up on each other, and you can easily just fluff it apart with your hand. This is because of a lack of cellulose. A fungus has gone through that wood and has eaten all of the binding agent being the cellulose. And it's a sugar, and it runs through, and it binds all of this stuff called lignin. All of that brown stuff is lignin. So when the fungus has ran through the wood, it's eaten all the cellulose, it leaves this brown stuff behind, and we call that a brown rot decayer. And so like the tree conchs, the red-belted conch, probably the most common mushroom you see in the woods around here is a brown rot decayer. It does this. It eats the cellulose out of those logs, and then the logs just fall apart. They turn to dust. Now ferns and other plants and animals and everything can use it again. So really, really important for our forest. And if you have questions, just interrupt or put your hand up. Yeah.
You said the fungus runs through. I assume it extends something, eats what it wants, and then retracts?
No, so the whole mycelium is just constantly climbing through its substrate in search of more food and good place to reproduce, I suppose. And so in the log, the mycelium will run all the way to the end of the log till it runs out of substrate. And at that point is often when it will create fruiting bodies, when it senses that it's ran out of food. So a little earlier I talked about how there is no central part of a fungus. So it's not like it's extending and retracting. It's just moving flow-like, and it's actually dying off behind itself and living as it travels on. So typically a log that has a bunch of mushrooms growing on it is because the fungus has eaten all of the good nutritional matter inside of it, and it senses that, and it goes, it's time to get our spores out into the air, right? And so that's a tricky thing about saprobic mushrooms, is because all these mushrooms that you see growing on wood, rotting wood, they're all saprobes. Tough to predict. I mean, you can go to a place where a lot of alder is, and those alder are falling down and rotting, and all of that rot is caused by a fungi, right? And so in that way, it can be somewhat predictable. But and then we have white rot decay, and you can find these right next to each other in the same forest. Yeah.
I had a question. Do they only reproduce sexually, or can they reproduce asexually through their hyphae underground?
That's a good question, and there is a slide about that a little bit later, but fungi can and do reproduce asexually, and more it's thought that all fungi do, and that perhaps sexual spores aren't as important as we've always thought. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. But this is called white rot decay, so it's the opposite, and a lot of fungus is like this. You're like lion's mane, oyster mushrooms. These are white rot decayers. So instead of eating the cellulose, they eat the lignin, and they leave behind the cellulose. So here, instead of those cubical stacks of brown wood, now you have this stringy, weird white material. And that is a fungus that has torn through that log and, eaten all the lignin and just left behind all of the cellulose. How come another fungus, a brown rot decayer, doesn't jump on that and just eat all of the cellulose? I don't know. I need to know that. If anybody knows that, feel free to chime in. But I've thought, why wouldn't they both, eat one log, eat half of the log, and then the other one come and eat the other half? I don't know. So the power of enzymes, fungi can produce hundreds of different enzymes on the fly, like we talked about, They produce chemicals and enzymes to break down compounds in nature, to make them usable to itself and to other organisms. A chemical called cellulase is produced by brown rot decayers, which breaks down cellulose. And to break down lignin, white rot, fungi use strong enzymes to speed up chemical reactions. So there we are again. The hyphae is running along. It's excreting these enzymes as it's going through the substrate, and these enzymes are effectively melting the biological matter around them, and then they can either absorb it or just push it out of their way as they continue to move on their way through the substrate. So these terms are commonly used by foresters. You might have heard these terms heart rot or sap rot, butt rot, canker rot, brown rot, white rot. And these are all caused by different kinds of fungus. And so foresters, they like classify areas by the type of rot that happens in them. And you know, dangerous trees. If you see a Dyer's polypore growing in your front yard, it could mean that it's parasitic on the base of a large Douglas fir that you have growing. So, you know, some of these mushrooms are an indicator that your tree has got butt rot going on, and it can take years before it becomes a hazard, before it actually starts to compromise the strength of the tree. Yeah?
Was root rot one of those, or is root rot something else?
You know, I'm not really sure. Root rot, I think that's just bacterial. I think that's soggy, too much water. And so if bacteria really like super wet substrates, and then fungi tends to like drier substrate. So I think root rot is more associated with a bacterial thing, with overwatering plants and stuff. So this is, you know, your main type of saprobic mushroom that we see is just a general duff litter decayer. You know, they express enzymes similar to those of brown rot fungi, and it aims to decay and eat cellulose and less dense molecules. So all of these little tiny saprobic mushrooms are kind of more like a brown rot decayer. That's a nice little cluster of hallucinogenic mushrooms that were photographed in Port Orchard. Psilocybe polliculosa growing amongst a whole bunch of Douglas fir needles. And that's their preferred substrate, one of our wild woodland hallucinogenic mushrooms. So there's a couple types of decomposers. There's primary decomposers, which just go ahead and start eating the wood. Oyster mushrooms, these are beautiful, edible. They'll be coming out soon, within the next couple months. They're one of the first ones that we'll see. And in fact, you can see them fruiting all year round. Right now, probably not, because it is literally frozen out. But give it a couple weeks, and you might be able to find a couple oysters starting to come out. These ones, another cold weather. I did not plan this, but these are all like cold weather loving mushrooms. It's really kind of cool. But this one, enoki, or the Flammulina filiformis, or Flammulina velutipes. I think we have filiformis here. And that's the true enoki. That one was actually photographed growing out of a log on Bainbridge Island in the Grand Forest. And I took a spore print of it, and I was able to cultivate it and grow it on wood chips. And it's such an amazing strain. It's like so strong and delicious. Lion's mane, shiitake, those are all primary decayers. And then secondary decayers, like agaricus, you know, your button mushrooms that come from the grocery store. Psilocybe cubensis, they're on manure. So an animal did half of the decaying for them, and then they're kind of picking up where everything was already broke down quite a bit. There's certain mushrooms that grow like that. That collection of agaricus is Agaricus buckmcdeweyii that was DNA confirmed up from the Newberry Hill area up there. And it's actually the picture now on iNaturalist and on Wikipedia, and I took it, so I'm a little bit proud about that. So, and then here's another type. So we talked about saprobes, and now we'll talk about mycorrhizal. And this word, like, just baffled me for a long time, but if you break it down, it might make it a little bit easier to understand. So, myco, meaning fungus, rhizae, meaning root, like a rhizomorph. So it's fungus root. Mycorrhizal, mycorrhizal. Everybody say it. Mycorrhizal. And I did this illustration, yes, you're welcome. Nice. And chanterelles, Amanita muscaria, these are mycorrhizal. They grow in an association with trees and or plants. So, oh, that's kind of weird. Mycorrhizal relations. So fungi use enzymes to break down nutrients into usable forms by the plants, and then the plants, converting sunlight into energy, they give in the form of carbon, like sugars and fats, to feed the hungry mycelium. So here we got a fungus growing underground, and it wraps around the tips of the roots of the trees. And so the tree is getting all this energy from the sun, and it's feeding out this carbon in the form of sugar and fat. And the fungus needs that. And it learned millions of years ago that it can take advantage of these trees or plants and get this carbon from the plants. And so those beautiful enzymes we kept talking about are getting broke down by the mycelium, and then the tree can absorb the phosphorus and the nitrogen that is being broke down by the enzymes from the fungus. So they work in a symbiotic relationship. And a lot of people seem to think that that means that it's like this harmonious love affair, but it's probably more like they have their guns pointed at each other, like, give me the sugar. Yeah.
As a rule, does this mean mycorrhiza have no capability for photosynthesis?
No, fungi doesn't in general. No, fungi does not photosynthesize at all. It has no chlorophyll. There's no green, there's no xylem or phloem, any of that kind of stuff if you know anything about plants. And so plants aren't that great at getting things out of the earth. They are good at getting energy from sunlight, but they don't create many enzymes. They don't know how to get phosphorus and nitrogen out of the soil. And so they depend on the enzyme creating abilities of the fungus. And so it works out good for both of them. But, you know, the market economy was invented by fungi 450 million years ago. You know, so we like to think we created supply and demand, but this is really where it started. The fungus is with the tree, and if the tree is not feeding, and if you want to read a good book, read Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. That's an amazing book, and he goes deep on this mycorrhizal stuff. But basically, if the tree is not putting out enough sugar for that fungus, the fungus is out of there. It's going to just move on. And so it really is demanding of these trees to feed them. And in a way, it's kind of in charge of the forest, the fungus is. And if the trees aren't putting out, they sicken and die because the fungus stop attaching to them. So this is a little bit of a mouthful, but it's important to know there's two different types of mycorrhizal fungi. So ectomycorrhizal. So all these big flashy mushrooms that we like to eat, like chanterelles, boletes, you know, even the amanitas, and most of these big mycorrhizal mushrooms that grow around here are ectomycorrhizal, and that means outside. Ecto means on the outside. So it envelops the outside of root tips of the plant, and it etches its way between the cells. So if you look at this side, this is a big root tip, and if you look at this side, the blue, this is hyphae. And it's creating this mantle on the outside of the root called a heartache net. And then it etches its way in, and you can see those white blocks. Those are to represent plant cells. And then it's etched its way in between the plant cells, and it's actually inside of the root, but it's not within the cell wall. And then we have arbuscular mycorrhizae. And that actually goes right through the wall of the root tip, and it gets into the cells. So it lives within the cells. And it can grow a little bit of hyphae that has a little spore on the end, but it doesn't create a fruiting body. So 95% of plants have arbuscular mycorrhizae with it. Grasses, all the plants you see, there are fungi living inside the cells of those plants, but they never produce a mushroom. They never produce a fruiting body. You would never know that they're there for the most part. But all, you know, our big, beautiful conifer forests, most of these big, flashy mushrooms that have big gills under them and stuff, these are all going to be ectomycorrhizal. They're living on the root tips of those trees. Not deep down. They're usually just within the first top couple inches. I went out with a mycologist once, and we carefully excavated away the soil of a root tip, and he showed me where it attached to a hyphae, and we traced it over to a mushroom. It was the coolest thing ever. If you got the patience, you know, you should check that out sometime. It's kind of neat. So some fungi are very plant specific. They develop this relationship over millions of years, and those plants are putting off the kind of sugar that fungus just seems to like. And the plant benefits from the certain enzymes that fungus produces. And so this one, the Lexinum scabrum, or birch bolete, we call it that because it only associates with birch. If you go to any Home Depot or the hospital or whatever, they got birches plant all over in their landscaping, and you find these mushrooms growing right underneath. This was taken at a Home Depot parking lot, Gig Harbor, and they have these nice scabers, and these are edible. Actually, the annual mushroom show used to serve that birch bolete bisque every year, and it's delicious. But over here we have Boletus borosii, or the white king, and those are quite promiscuous. They will hook up with all kinds of different trees. So they're not so specific. You know, the Lexinum, it's very monogamous. It stays with its one tree type, but a lot of these Boletus will hop around to different hosts. One time I got in trouble at Islandwood for making a joke about that. I won't do it here tonight. Parasitic fungi. So there was saprobes, mycorrhizal, and then parasites. So parasitic and pathogenic fungi form symbiotic relationships with other living organisms, similarly to mycorrhizal fungi. However, they benefit to the detriment and sometimes to the death of their host. So there is no payout for the plant to have a parasite. It's just problematic usually. And so some of them will grow on other mushrooms. This one, a really common, popular edible mushroom, Hypomyces lactiflorum, is a type of parasitic fungus that attacks a host called the Russula brevipes, and it contorts it. It changes its color and its flavor and its smell and everything into this beautiful lobster mushroom. So this is a parasitic infection on a host mushroom. Right here, cordyceps. This is an amazing thing that can take over the mind and muscles of insects. It's growing on a larvae there, I think, but this is a fungus that actually will get into the brain of an ant and make it climb up to the tallest branch of a tree and climb out there and hang off of a leaf, and then mushrooms will pop out of the ant's head and spread spores from up there. So really, really cool. They call it the zombie ant fungus sometimes. This one up in the top right corner is Armillaria, or a honey mushroom, and that is a parasitic fungi. I have some neighbors in my neighborhood, downtown Port Orchard, cute little place, and they have a little orchard of trees that are maybe like 15 years old, fruit trees like pear trees and apple trees. And the end of last summer, I saw big clusters of honey mushrooms coming up in their yard, and I was like, oh no, because they're parasitic on those trees, so their whole orchard is infected with these honey mushrooms. They probably have no idea, and I don't want to go tell them. The trees probably could just have a few years left, and they're all going to start dying, and you're going to wonder why. It's a fungus.
And there's no saving them.
There's no saving them. There's no way. There's no way. I mean, the smallest amount of hyphae that is microscopic is enough to start a whole new fungal colony. It's impossible to eradicate it from soil. It's just not going to happen.
So they would not be able to replant then, probably.
Well, maybe once the trees died, the fungus would probably die too when it runs out of nutrition, and then you can start over again. But if you try to replant right away, it would probably hop on and cause more trouble. But it can take years for that to happen, so they might have a few more years. But I'm going to monitor it. This is a cool one, the parasitic piggybacks, Astrophora lycoprodoides. That actually was kind of rare, but this year they were everywhere. So it's weird because some years, you're like, oh, I found it, the parasitic powder cap. And then last year it's like, there's another one. These aren't even cool anymore. But they grow these mushrooms on top of other mushrooms. That's a big blackening Russula, the nigricans group. And then on top of it are the Astrophora. And that powdery cap is actually asexual spores. And
I love that mushroom.
yeah, it's really cool. And if you look underneath, it has these weird underdeveloped gills, sexual gills, that they almost look like they're full of clear gelatin sometimes. They're just so bizarre.
They're almost entirely reproducing asexually.
Yeah, I think they only produce a couple spores.
You will not see any sexual spores on those gills at all.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and that's the name Astrophora comes from the star-shaped spore. They actually look like a star. I think I have a slide, and I'll show some of the different spore shapes. So can fungi infect humans? That's a question. There's about 200 different fungi that are infectious to people. They're often opportunistic, microscopic pathogens, meaning we live with or near them all the time, but they can only infect people who have weakened or compromised immune systems. The most dangerous in the critical group, which contains just 4 fungal pathogens, Cryptococcus, Aspergillus, Candida, 2 different types of Candida, which can grow on skin and mucous membranes, can cause severe infections. And then Chondosterium, Schizophilum, valley fever. These are other things that can get to people. And a lot of people, I'm sure, have heard of Schizophilum in here. Schizophilum communi. This is a really common tree conch mushroom, but it looks like a turkey tail, but it has gills underneath it. And when you put a UV light on it, it glows. These are my photos. That's really cool. Looks really cool. But unfortunately, it can cause terrible infection from breathing in the spores. And so unfortunately, this lady died back in 2016. She was the mother of these 3 boys, and she got a weird, rare infection of Schizophilum, started growing in her lungs, moved to her brain. They were cutting tumors off of her brain. For 12 years, she lived with this fungus growing inside of her, and she finally died. It typically happens. There's only been 71 cases worldwide. Most of them are from Japan. Her case was from New Zealand. And I actually talked to Dr. Michael Buke today on the phone, asking him about the Schizophilum infections, and he was saying that there's several subspecies of the schizophylum, and it seems that all of it happens in subtropical areas where it's warmer, and that's where it seems to be a problem. So, I was like, should we be worried if we're up close taking photos of schizophylum? He said, I would probably not be in an enclosed area. He said, in fact, when I do a big ID tables, we try to keep them outside because even oyster mushroom spores have been known to germinate and cause people problems in their lungs. So, yeah.
Did you notice last year in the Shelton burn that everybody was hunting morels? The logs had the schizophylum on it.
Yeah, lots of
I've
it.
never seen one before until
Oh.
then, and I thought maybe it's like a natural thing after a burn.
Yeah, I don't know that they're associated with fire naturally, but yeah, they were everywhere there. And there's some fruit trees right in my neighborhood where there's all kinds of schizophylum growing on it, and they're really cool. And I like flipping them over and going, oh, look, there's the gills. That's where the deadly man-eating spores get produced, So I don't know. Maybe I might think twice when I'm like trying to get real intimate with the schizophylum anymore because it's really rare, but it can grow in you. And like Dr. Buke told me today, we are so close to fungi that is once it's in you, it is so hard to kill it without killing the host because we're so much like the fungus that it just lives within you, which is just insane to think about, right? So, speaking of spores, mushrooms produced by spores. So it's just it's a little tiny cell. I mean, these things are so small. Like I showed you this gill. I did too good of a job of hiding it, but here's the gill. You can see that little tiny black spot on there, smaller than it's about the size of a watermelon seed. That's 2,000 times the size of an actual spore. Spores are, an average spore is maybe 9 microns, right? That is so small. A quarter inch is 6,700 microns. So you do that math. But this is what an average typical spore looks like. Little footballs. They're ellipsoid shapes. Look like little pumpkin seeds. But these are some of the more interesting ones. Ionocebi mixtilis group. They look like little turtles, which are kind of cool. The Astrophora, we were just talking about that. Those look like suns. And then over there, the Ionocebi curvipes group. They look like little rockets. There's a whole bunch of other cool ones, and we could talk about those another time. But some of them can shoot their spores up to 20 inches from a mushroom. That's typically in the ascos. So these mushrooms, like I said, their spores just kind of fall straight down. They get caught in wind currents, and they depend on things to carry them that way. But sometimes, they don't really get their spores out into the wind. And asco produces its spores on top, and it ejects them out into the wind. And sometimes you can just blow on an ascomycete and watch a big cloud of spores come off of it, which is really cool. Yeah?
What level of magnification do you need to see a typical spore?
You can start seeing spores at 40x or what, at the smallest magnification. And at 1,000 is where I measure them with an oil immersion objective. But you can see them with the smallest objective on any compound microscope that's out there. They just look like tiny, really tiny little spots. Yeah.
I actually heard that some mushrooms, if they're not getting like wind current, that they can produce their own to try and get it higher.
That is true. That is true. And that's actually a slide that I took out of here because I was trying to reduce how long this talk actually was. But yeah, mushrooms are known to be 1 degree cooler underneath their cap than they are on top of the cap. And I had an experiment where I grew some mushrooms, put them in a sealed tote, and it was a dark spored mushroom, and you could see the swirl pattern on the top of every cap where it would create a little convection from that little difference in temperature, creates this tiny little air current that spins the spores off and up off the top of the cap. And you can see that if you got a black background and a bright backlight, sometimes you'll see the spores and they're kind of drifting around the mushroom, but often going like this, like a wisp of a candle coming off the top of the cap. But
It was a nice picture.
huh?
It was a nice picture.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So gender isn't really a fungal construct. Some species of fungi can have over 36,000 sexually compatible genders.
That's pretty good mildly.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I mean, it's pretty anthropomorphic, I get that, but I kind of like doing that personally because it helps us to wrap our head around it when we can put it into understandable terms, So fungal mating happens before fruit body production. Plants mate at the end of their life cycle. That's when they produce flowers, and then they have to be pollinated and all of that. But fungi mate underground before they ever produce a mushroom. So if you've seen a mushroom, the deed has been done. And in that way, spores, spores are less like seeds and they're more like pollen, because they have to hook up with a matching set of like chromosomes. They can't do it on their own. So it's not a ready-made package. It's more like pollen in a way that it has to come together with another one in the perfect substrate, with the perfect humidity, the perfect moisture, the perfect timing, the perfect temperature for them to sprout. And that's why mushrooms produce so many spores, because the chances of that happening are so little that every mushroom is just a miracle if you think about it. You know what I mean? It's just crazy. So a mushroom is essentially just a cluster of hyphae that gets pushed out of the ground. So you have all these little strands running through the ground. Some of them are getting together, starting to form little strands that you can see with your eyes. And when it comes time to make a fruiting body, they cluster together and they push out of the ground into this weird shape, and then they start to produce different cells on them, like basidia, and chylocystia, and pleurocystidia. But if you take a slice of a mushroom and you put it in a microscope, and you take a little piece of the mycelium from underground and put it in a microscope, it's the same thing. Yeah?
How long are the spores viable?
Spores can be viable for years and years and years. I'm not exactly sure on the number. Brian, do you know anything about how long spores can last? I mean, they've been found in outer space. I think they can last probably hundreds of years. I don't know, but
I'm not really sure.
yeah, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to Google that one. That's really interesting to know. So, the gill on a mushroom. It's like these slits of paper, on this, it's kind of a loose representation of what gills look like under there. And if I pulled one off, it's just like a slit of paper, and there'll be hundreds or thousands, sometimes only 5 or 6, Alan at Rockefeller just posted a picture of this marasmias from Ecuador that has 9 gills, That's so cool. Like some mushrooms are like, I need 500 gills to make my spores, and that mushroom's like, I need 9. I just need 9. But if you think about it, this is a genius way to maximize surface area. So a gill has basidia on each side, and it's growing spores on each side of it. So if you were to take every single gill and lay them all out on a table, it would cover a huge area. I mean, depending on the size of the mushroom, it would cover a lot of area. And then you flip that over, and that's also spore-producing area. So talk about a lot of fertile surface packed into a small little container. Mushrooms are very smart with how they've evolved to be shaped that way and to maximize the amount of spores that they can make. And as I just mentioned, the chances of everything lining up, the sexual mating to happen between 2 different spores, and the substrate to be the right temperature, the right moisture, and the right, composition, it's just crazy what it takes. So that's why they have to produce so many spores. And they produce them on something called basidia. And they're these cells that look somewhat like that. Another one of my artwork masterpieces. But they typically produce 4 spores per basidia, sometimes 2 spores, and some I think that produce 8 spores even. But an example of a 2 spore.
Centrals produce 6.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah.
But like our grocery store button mushroom, the Latin name is Agaricus bisporus. So bi meaning 2, sporus meaning spores. 2 spores. So if you look at the basidia, it only grows 2 spores per cell. Most mushrooms that you look at in the microscope are going to have 4 spores per basidia. So we'll look at the life cycle of fungi. This talk might be going faster than I thought it was, so we might have an early night. I don't know.
Some kid telling stories.
Huh?
He's
Yeah.
a kid telling stories.
I gave a talk in Hoquiam last night, and this little boy was in the front row with just a million questions and stories. It was fun. So the life cycle of fungi. It starts with a spore. It's carried on wind currents, insects, animals, or people, or water. And I didn't put it in here, and I should have, but on the far right are spores of a truffle. And so that's a type of sequestrate fungi. So there's certain types of fungi that have evolved over the years to move underground. a mushroom that's living out in harsh conditions. Maybe it's getting beat up by animals, or the weather is just rough, or whatever it is. It has evolved and decided it's too rough out here. Let's go underground and start producing our spores. But how are we going to get discovered now? We can't get our spores into the wind. And so they start to produce these amazing scents, and animals and humans get attracted to these scents, and we dig them up and we eat them, and we carry the spores in our excrement and deposit them. And so they have these really big, thick, rough spores to survive going through a digestive tract of an animal or something. We have some local truffles that grow around here, and I was talking truffles earlier before the meeting. I have a truffle dog my wife trained, and it's really fun. And so at a certain time of, these truffles start growing underground months ago, but they only ripen at a certain time, and then the dog can detect it and gently dig it up for us, and they're delicious. Now, squirrels and voles, they are kind of our wild counterparts that like to eat the truffles and then carry them with them. David Aurora, in his book Mushrooms Demystified, suggests that you can go into a forest and try to find some squirrel dung on a branch, and then put it in a microscope to see what kind of truffle spores there are, and you can determine what kind of truffles are in that forest. I have looked on a lot of branches for squirrel dung, and I can't find any. It's super hard to find. But, there's gastroid fungi like puffballs and those earth stars. Those are on their way to being truffleized. There's truffles there's hundreds of different types of truffles. There's one's called a rhizopogon that is basically a suillus, like a bolete mushroom that just is completely enclosed. It doesn't want to let its spores off anymore. There are some mushrooms that are called secotioid, and they just never open their cap. They're somewhere in this evolutionary or adaptive phase of their life cycle, and they just produce their spores that never hit the wind, but they'll just turn into a pile of mush. And oftentimes they're growing around areas where water is rushing downhill fast. So some of these secotioid mushrooms probably get their spores carried on small streams of temporary water during deluges and downpours and stuff. And so it's quite an adaptation that I was listening to this podcast, and this guy was saying we should drop the word evolution and we should just use adaptation, because that drives all of evolution, was adapting to their environmental and outside factors. And it was a pretty good point. But once you go truffle, you can't go back. That's what Noah Siegel says. These mushrooms that have moved underground, now they can't go back to a regular gilled mushroom anymore. But there is a telestoma, a stalked truffle that went underground, and it decided it wasn't making that good of a living there, so it started growing a stalk, and now it pushes its truffle back up over the surface, hoping that something comes by and eats it. Pretty crazy. So, it starts with a spore, and I really should say 2 spores, because the life cycle of fungi, it's going to take 2 different spores, 2 different mating types to come together to start to form a mycelium that's viable and is capable of producing mushrooms. So the spore lands and it germinates. There's a spore germinating right there. Much like seeds, the right moisture, humidity can cause spores to germinate. I have mounted spores on a microscope slide, and left it on my microscope for a couple hours and came back, and they were all sprouting. And I was like, oh, I ruined it, and I threw it away. And then I tried to purposely reproduce that, and it's so hard to do. I'm like, man, I got so lucky that one time. I wish I could have got more pictures of it and stuff. Me and Alan Rockefeller tried to get some to germinate on some molasses water on a slide in a time lapse, but we weren't having any good luck there either. So the new colony starts growing in the substrate. This is the mycelial growth stage. It's exploring its environment. It's going around or through obstacles as needed or possible. It's creating enzymes and chemicals as it encounters new things on its way to dissolve and break them down as a food source. So this is under like a little Buddha statue I had in my front landscape. I picked it up, and this huge rhizomorphic mycelium is growing under there. And I can't tell what kind of fungus that is until it produces a fruiting body, or if you had DNA analysis done on it. But that's one thing about fungus, is you can't really tell its identity until it produces a fruiting body. So it's kind of weird that, we do these fungal diversity surveys based on fruiting bodies that we can see growing above ground, but what does that really mean is going on underground? It's just the only evidence we're seeing are the sexual reproductive organs. And, and I talked to Britt Bunyard. We went on a walk last fall, and one of these topics that constantly gets brought up is the cut or pluck. And a lot of people say, well, if you're over harvesting, that's a problem. You're taking too many mushrooms out of the woods. And I don't know who's got the authority to say what's the right amount to take, but a lot of people would think you've taken too many. Now they're not producing spores, right? So common sense would tell you that is going to have some impact at a certain level. If you're taking all the sexual spores out of a habitat, it's going to have some sort of an effect on the progeny of future associations and stuff. But what Britt was saying is that maybe those sexual spores aren't as important as we once thought. That all fungi go through this asexual phase. They create something called conidia, and they can clone themselves. So all fungi clones themselves, and also a huge mycelium at a certain point will often shatter itself. It completely fragments itself into a million different little pieces, and those all become individual colonies. And a lot of them don't survive, but a shattered mycelium can start 10 more colonies and never produce a fruiting body. It doesn't necessarily need those spores as much as we once thought, because they're doing a lot underground that people don't even really understand yet. So the sexual mating happens before the fruit body production. Down here the spore comes down, it creates the hyphae, and then it can go into this asexual phase and create these conidia, or these asexual spores, and then they can start to grow. And the mycelium can actually fuse back into itself. So, if there's a mycelium underneath here, this mushroom sprouts up on top of its own mycelium. It's dropping spores. Sure, some of those are going to germinate, and they will fuse back in with its main colony and continue to proliferate that particular colony. Now, Jack Johnson has a theory that if you pick that some mushrooms have a short-lived lifespan, like amanitas perhaps, don't have this super long lifespan, and that perhaps by picking enough of them that you could kill a patch potentially. But there's been studies done about overpicking mushrooms in Oregon. The famous chanterelle study went on for 10 years or more, where they went out and they picked every single fruiting body, not just chanterelles, but every mushroom that they saw on this certain plot of land. Every year they went, and every mushroom that came up, they picked it to see if it would do anything, and it didn't have any effect. Over years and years, the fungus continued to produce, regardless of the amount of spores that were being dropped into that forest. Keep in mind, there's spores all in the wind all the time. Even schizophilum spores are in here with us, so don't be alarmed. But it's kind of interesting that they conducted that same study, but they found that the trampling of those areas was what really seemed to impact fruit body production. So a lot of trampling of the ground. The mycelium doesn't seem to like that very much. And so they did another study where they built these ramps that went, were this high off the forest floor, going through the woods, and they would go through on the ramps, picking the mushrooms, not trampling the ground, and everything performed as usual. So really it's the heavy trampling of human feet and traffic that could have the biggest impact on the forest. And I've noticed that there's some areas in South Kitsap that are just prime time. It looks like prime habitat for like chanterelles. And it's Douglas fir forest, and they're 40 years old, and there's moss, there's salal and huckleberry, everything that I would expect to see chanterelles, and I just don't see them. But what I do see is a lot of rubber bands and a lot of yarn laying around, and it's these agricultural brush pickers that have been picking that salal for so many years that I'm convinced that they've trampled that ground so hard that the mycelium's like, screw it, we're not even going to try here anymore, Once in a while you find a freak chanterelle in those heavily brush picked areas, but typically you don't find a lot of mushrooms in areas where there's a lot of brush pickers. So then, we've the hyphae, two different types of hyphae will come together and then fuse. And then now they've made this sexually complete mycelium, and then they can go on to produce a mushroom. So there's fungus traveling around all underground, just single and lonely, and it's just going to die that way, Can't ever find its mate. So here's some conidia. This is penicillium. And so this is just the hyphae. in a microscope, just 1,000 times oil objective on a regular compound microscope. You can get one on Amazon for like $200 for a decent, okay microscope to look at fungal structures. Really suggest it. If you're a mushroom nerd and you want to take it to the next level, you should get a microscope, because this time of year there's not a lot of mushrooms out there to look at. But if you have a box of mushrooms that you saved, you can just go, I'm kind of bored tonight, I'm going to go check out the gill of this mushroom or whatever, you know, and it just adds like a whole nother layer of this thing. And so this is hyphae. Time up. This is the hyphae, and then it's growing these asexual spores on it, and so these are the conidia, and they're produced by the conversion of hyphal elements. They're born on sporogenous cells or within specialized structures called conidiophores. So, you know, the hyphae, as it goes along, it can produce different kinds of cells along the way. Again, without a brain, we don't know how it knows. So some fungi can go into a sclerotial stage. So it's called a sclerotium. And what it is like a hard knot of mycelium, and it's got food reserves, and this is for surviving for a long time in adverse conditions where there's drought and stuff. A lot of people think that morels have this capacity, a lot of the burned morels, that there's probably sclerotium laying underneath the forest floor everywhere, and a lot of it isn't activated until a fire goes over it, and then these sclerotia come to life. And they can either come to life in the form of mycelium or just start producing fruiting bodies. And so this is one of the coolest mushrooms that I encountered last fall. And if you look, it looks like a little apple seed, and then growing out of that apple seed is a mushroom. And that's actually a sclerotium that grows in a blackening russula, and then it grows this little tiny mushroom called a colibia right out of the top of it. I can't think of the species name right now. I'm having a total brain fart, but that one was really cool. It was this blackening russula. It looked like it was full of apple seeds, and then out of those little apple seeds, the mushrooms were growing. Over there is another conidia that's going straight to fruiting. And so there's something called psychedelic truffles, if you've ever seen something like that, you know. And if you go to Holland or Amsterdam, you know, they have a pretty relaxed drug culture over there. Cannabis has been legal for a long time, but psychedelic mushrooms are still illegal, like to buy fruiting bodies or to sell fruiting bodies. But there's a little loophole. And there's a type of psychedelic mushroom called Psilocybe tamponensis that grows sclerotium. And so they're not out, the sclerotium isn't considered fruit bodies, but it's still hallucinogenic. It still contains all those compounds. So they're able to sell these little chunks of sclerotium as truffles, although they're nothing like a truffle at all. And so if you go to Amsterdam, they'll have all these like places where they're selling magic truffles. And that's what it is a little sclerotia that's hallucinogenic. And then after that, then they can start to fruit, you know. Those ones over on the right, that's a pretty cool one called a rhizocybe that I found at Banner Forest. And over here, this is a big mess of just crazy rhizomorphic mycelium and the starts of some young mushrooms right there. So this is the stage where you get your basket filled. After all of that, we finally get some mushrooms. It's a pretty basket of mushrooms. So some mushrooms glow in the dark. About 71 different species of mycenas. A lot of them are mycenas. About 71 different species glow in the dark. And it's likely to get bugs to spread their spores. There's one called the the Neonathopanus. This one grows in Brazil at the base of these coconut palms. And it was described in the 1800s, but it was kind of lost to science. And just somewhat recently, a mycologist was down there and he noticed these kids in the street were throwing this glowing material back and forth, and he thought it was something they got out of the sea, but it happened to be one of these mushrooms that grow on these coconut palms like this, and they glow super duper bright. They even actually seem to have a sleep cycle to conserve their energy. They don't glow as bright during the day as they do at night. And so they were curious. They started looking at these mushrooms, and there's little beetles that would be climbing all over them at nighttime. Then the question was, well, are they eating them or are they doing something else? So they made little lamps that look just like these mushrooms and set them out there, and they have the same spectrum of light, and the beetles came to the lamps. So it went to show that they're attracted to that light. And when they started to look at the beetles' legs, they noticed that there was spores all over them. And so the beetles were actually carrying the spores of these mushrooms off into the forest. And this is such a dense Amazonian part, this rainforest that there is no wind currents blowing through this super thick jungle. So this fungus said, hey, what if I make some light and attract insects to carry my spores for me, right? Really pretty smart. This one's called Termitomyces. There's about 52 different species in the world, but most of them occur in Africa and India. And these are huge mushrooms that grow on termite mounds. It's actually farmed by the termites, and the termites also eat the mushrooms, but so do humans. And they're a really, really delectable edible. Now, I've never eaten them. I did go to India, and we looked everywhere, but couldn't find any. But look at the size of that one that he's carrying right there. That's a pretty famous picture on the internet. Things like 3 feet around. They can get huge. These are really amazing. One of our guests that's been to this club, Sidney Ober-Singleton, he did our dye workshop last July. He runs this lab at the University of Oregon in Eugene, and all of these totes are in this basement lab, and I got to go down there and make a video with him. Really cool. And these are the leafcutter ants, and if you look back here, this is the fungus that they farm in these big tubs. So these ants go out at night, and they can defoliate an entire tree full of leaves. They take these leaves back to this fungus, they chew it up and regurgitate it. The fungus eats it, and then it creates these little food packets, these little tiny nutritional packets that the ants then carry off to their friends, and they eat them. There's some big, huge killer ants, and these things will bite the crap out of you too. You do not want to tangle with the leafcutter ants. In fact, he had like this crazy talcum powder mixture that he put on the edge of this to keep them from climbing over the side. But they'll build bridges out of each other. They'll make these strings that go across and climb across each other. Really crazy. And if they sense that anything is going to potentially harm their fungus, they'll immediately kill it and throw it into their waste pile. And so any other kind of fungus or an ant that's acting a little suspect or something, they're like, you're done, you're done. They kill them, take them out to the dump. Really amazing. And so this fungus doesn't grow anywhere except for with the ants, and the ants don't eat anything but what the fungus produces for them. This has been going on for millions of years. Really, really cool. So this is the fungus, and through DNA we discovered that it's actually a leucoagaricus. That's related to a really common white mushroom that grows around here in the early summer in the lawns. And so Leucoagaricus gongylifera, but there is no actual evidence of a photo of a fruiting body ever being produced by this fungus. Never seems to grow a mushroom. And Sydney said that it's probably because it smells funny to the ants, or that it could perhaps become bacterial, and the ants do not want to mess with the risk of bacteria being introduced to their nest, so they pinch them off before they ever get started. You'll just never see one. The ants take care of them and get rid of them.
That's a way to be able to control the,
God?
from-
Is that you? What?
It's, from Zoom here. So
Yeah, I know.
That's a way to be able to control the behind there. That's a way to be able to control the ants in the wild if they start to, because I think in your videos you made, you said there's no natural competitor to them, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
so
right.
if you attack the fungal food source, then that's the way to get them. That's their Achilles.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. And so one of the most amazing things about the leafcutter ants that I thought is that the queen ant has something called a infrabuccal pocket inside of her cheek. And so when it's time to start a new colony, she'll take a small piece of the mycelium and put it in her pocket, and she'll walk off into the forest and she'll spit it out and then start to tend it and grow a new colony of fungus and a new colony of ants. So really amazing. So the earliest cultivation of mushrooms, 200 to 300 BC in China, they started growing these wood ears, and you can see why it's called that, auricularia. Actually a good edible, even though it looks a little bit freaky. The oak mushroom, early on the cultivators list, about 800 years ago, they started doing shiitake on logs. And one way to get these to fruit is to smack the log, and it makes the fungus think that the log had fallen off the tree onto the forest floor, and that means that it's time to grow. So if you're ever transporting shiitake logs or sawdust logs that are myceliated with shiitake, you want to be gentle with them because you don't want them to think that it's time to fruit. Your button mushroom, this one, everybody knows this. It's like our American mushroom. It's like the only one they sell in the stores, really. It was farmed in France when a farmer discovered they grew well on manure-based compost. And so the white button mushroom is just a mutation of the brown button mushroom. And then the portobello is just a full-grown version of that too. So it's all the same thing. And you can find them in the wild, even though they're pretty rare. And they don't look like these white ones. This was a farmer was growing these, and there was one white mushroom, a weird mutation. And he thought, wow, that looks cleaner. I bet people would buy them if they thought they were cleaner. So he cloned it. And now every white button mushroom in the world came from that one genetic mutation. And, you know, our mycophobic culture is like, oh, we don't want dirty mushrooms. Let's take the white ones instead. You know, it's the same thing. Because we live in a mycophobic culture, but there's mycophilic cultures. You know, different cultures have different relationships with fungi. So, you know, in Western Europe, they called them toadstools. They were associated with evil and darkness and got kicked over, you know, and that would explain why we brought that sentiment with us, and we have one type of mushroom in the grocery store. Nowadays, you see a few more different types, and some of the better grocery stores have several types of mushrooms, which is nice. But if you go to a Chinese market, they're going to have like 30 or 40 different kinds of wild mushrooms to choose from, because they've been living with mushrooms and foraging them forever and ever. China produces 75% more mushrooms than America, 35 million tons a year. It's crazy. They love mushrooms. So poison or food, this is a little confusing. These ones in the genus Turbinellus, we affectionately call them the bed poopers, chanterelle. You know, maybe a little more vulgar than that. But, you know, in Mexico and Southeast Asia, they have these in the markets for sale. Perhaps they have a stronger constitution. They can handle other types of food. Maybe they just cook them way longer. Maybe it's a little bit of a different species. But, you know, we call them poisonous, and nobody really questions that kind of thing. And then over here, Gyromitra esculenta. It's been known to kill people. These are going to start coming up pretty soon. And if you eat those raw, they contain something called gyromitrin that metabolizes into this monomethyl hydrazine in your stomach. That's a rocket fuel, and it's very, very deadly. But when detoxified boiled a couple times, you can detoxify it. And they did this in Eastern Europe after wartime. It was cold, the people were poor, everything was destroyed. The only thing that started growing on the landscape after these long, cold winters might be these mushrooms. So they found a way to detoxify them and eat them for survival's sake. Now, people still try to do that. It's completely unnecessary, and it's kind of dangerous, frankly. If you look into the literature, in the 1700s, there was a dinner party where 40 people died from eating these mushrooms. But the last, you know, the species epithet, what Gyromitra esculenta means delicious, which is kind of weird because when it was named in 1800, the guy who named it, I think it was Hilliard, he loved eating these. He thought they were just so delicious, and he had no problems with them, you know, so whatever. I'm not going to try eating them. So psychedelic use of mushrooms, we're kind of talking ethnomycology a little bit. You know, kind of got on our radar in Western America and the Western world from Central America. A mycologist named Gordon Wasson and his wife were into traveling the world to look for how different cultures use different mushrooms, and he heard about this culture in Mexico where they were eating these mushrooms and seeing visions of God. So he went down there to discover it, and he met this lady named Maria Sabina, and she took him on this psychedelic journey. He came back to America and published this article in Time magazine, caused all these hippies to flood down into Mexico and blow up the whole spot and really kind of ruin the whole deal. Then there were discoveries in the 1970s in British Columbia and right here in Washington State, where they started to discover we have a lot of psychedelic mushrooms that grow around here. And a lot of them are named for this area and for professors. I gave a talk at the annual mushroom show a couple years ago all about the mind-altering mushrooms of this area. And they're all little brown mushrooms, all potentially can look like deadly mushrooms. So let's talk a little bit about some medicinal mushrooms. Here's the reishi. This picture was taken here in Bremerton. Looks like E.T., and they've been using this in Chinese medicine for thousands of years. You can slice it up and simmer it for a long time. It's kind of bitter, so a lot of people make hot chocolate out of it. It's supposed to be an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, among many, many other things. And there's a lot of different species of these Ganoderma. This one's Ganoderma organism. Yep.
You said it's medicinal and used in China. Do you mean it's like TCM, or is this adopted in Western medicine as well?
Traditional Chinese medicine, and, you know, And so it still is. It's not really recognized by the American Medical Association or anything like that. But turkey tail, this one's being studied, probably the most highly studied medicinal mushroom in the world for cancer therapy and stuff. Really, really common. It grows these concentric rings of different colors. And when you flip it over, it's going to have a creamy white surface underneath, a porous surface. Beautiful little mushroom. If you have fruit trees that ever got cut down in your yard, that stump's probably got some of these growing on it. It's immune boosting, cancer therapy, anti-inflammatory. Last week I started feeling that tickle in my throat like I was getting sick, and I made a nice cup of turkey tail tea with some local honey, and I was down for maybe a day and a half, and I'm going to attribute my fast recovery to this mushroom. So the bleeding tooth fungus, this one, Hydnellum peckii, it's being investigated for its anticoagulant properties, but overall just like a super photogenic mushroom, and it's actually pretty common around here. And it grows in October and November when it starts to rain a lot, and it creates this red guttation that looks like blood, but it's non-toxic, and it's fun to lick it and impress your friends, and it makes a good dyer's mushroom. The lion's mane, I took this picture in Bremerton, even though it's pretty rare. One of the legislators in the state was trying to push for this to be our state mushroom, which just seems outrageous because it's pretty rare around here. It's way more common east of the Rockies, but also good for your gut health, immune system, mental focus. Any mushroom supplement you see, that you buy at the store, most of them are going to say lion's mane on the side of the package. This one's interesting. The alcohol inky cap, Copernopsis atramentaria, has a bad reaction with alcohol. The same thing like antabuse they used to give to bad alcoholics, make you super sick if you eat these and then you start drinking. But if you don't drink, they're okay to eat. And they were shown to cause testicular damage in rats. So in the 1970s, they actually looked into making male contraceptives out of these mushrooms. Interesting. So here's some deadly mushrooms. This is your death cap, Amanita phalloides. Not as common as you might think. It's always in association with like non-native trees for the most part. In California, they've been shown to start associating with some live oak trees. But around here, it's linden, hornbeam, types of oak that were imported with the mushrooms typically growing already on the roots with the fungus on the roots. I know of a patch of them in Tacoma, but they're not as common as you think. I've had to seek them out, and I just think they're beautiful. They don't smell bad necessarily. They don't look bad. So some of the indicators is going to be this egg-like structure that it's growing out of, this volvate sac. And it looks like an egg that's got this mushroom growing out of it. If you see that sac and then you see this big skirt hanging off of it or that partial veil, those two things alone should be enough for you to see some serious red flags. Don't be eating that kind of a mushroom.
My understanding is a lot of the poisonings from Amanita phalloides are from southeast regions.
Yeah, and they mistake them for a different edible Amanita.
They mistake them for Vulvarella.
Well, that or Amanita principes looks just like this and has a vulva, which is scary. And so I'm like, if I went to Thailand and was served some of that, I'd probably be like, I don't know, man, I'm gonna pass. So these are really closely related. Amanita section phalloideae, the destroying angels. There's about 4 different species. Not happening around here, really. You don't see the destroying angels around here, but they contain these amatoxins. No bright red flags. You cannot look at a mushroom and say that's poisonous unless you know what that mushroom is. And looking at a mushroom and saying that looks delicious is pretty reckless because, in my opinion, some of these mushrooms look delicious. So here's another deadly one that actually does grow around here, Cortinarius rubellus, or the deadly webcap. And there's a lot of different Cortinarius, about 450 different Cortinarius in the area. I've never personally found these. It would be kind of cool, but I don't. Nobody's really out hunting for Cortinarius to eat. This one, the deadly cone cap, is a pretty common lawn mushroom, or Conocybe phalaris, or now we're calling it Philiotina phalaris, or Philiotina rugosa. And it's got this really prominent little ring on the stem, so look out for that. And then it's got this rusty orange color spore print. And they're pretty small and delicate, but they are deadly if you ate enough. These ones, the deadly dapperling, one of the deadly lepiota. So be careful with these lepiota. They sure are ornamented and beautiful, great, very photogenic, but some of them can be really deadly with amatoxins, the same things that are in death caps. And then probably our most common deadly mushroom around here. We really don't have that many deadly mushrooms. So a lot of people are so scared of mushrooms. And it's like they're really not that common. But this one, the Galerina marginata, named because it leaves little material hanging off the edge of the margin a lot of the time. That's the edge of the cap right there. And they have a rusty brown spore print, and they grow on wood. And the real danger for those is they can be confused with psilocybe mushrooms, with hallucinogenic mushrooms. So those people that are foraging for edible mushrooms aren't picking little brown mushrooms off logs or wood chips. But if you're looking for hallucinogenic mushrooms, which around here they're all little brown mushrooms, they could be confused for Galerina marginata, and it has happened. But we have pretty good medical facilities these days.
Didn't you say in one of your videos you pointed out that they were actually growing right next to?
Absolutely, yeah. I've got a couple of videos where I'm like,
grab a whole patch.
here's the Galerina, here's the psilocybe within arm's reach of each other, which makes it kind of dangerous. And so like candy caps, we have some candy cap food over here. There's some candy cap popcorn and cookies and stuff. And that's a little lactarius. It's kind of orange. It kind of gets a little brown in the center when they're more mature. And the reason why the Washington State Department of Agriculture won't allow those to be sold commercially is because they could be confused for the Galerina, which, and if you were picking really fast in a patch, you could potentially pick a couple of the wrong mushrooms and get them mixed up in that. I mean, to a mushroom expert like Sean, I see him grimacing over here, you would never make that mistake, right? But who knows who's picking your mushrooms, you know what I mean? So if I'm buying commercial candy caps, I want to know that like a few Galerinas didn't make it in there. Here's Galerina versus psilocybe. So this is Galerina marginata growing on some wood decay, and then psilocybe stuntzii growing on wood chips. They could look pretty close, you know what I mean? And people get kind of reckless up there. Speaking of dying.
Having N-acetyl acid, NAC, N-acetylcysteine, and milk thistle handy could be a way to be able to at least, if somebody did ingest it, if you have it in your little kit, just like you would have a Band-Aid, that'd be something you could save their life with, I think.
I've definitely heard of that. There's a milk thistle recipe. Dr. Bug was trying to get that to be standardized in all the hospitals, but he says that they just kind of roll their eyes at him. So I don't know who has that.
They're going to support it for sure.
Yeah. So I'm going to move kind of quick because we're running out of time. This talk was adapted from another one, but here, all of this yarn was dyed, all this fabric dyed with different mushrooms. So mushrooms produce fungal pigments that attach to protein fabric like wool and silk. Animal produced fabric and fiber. So here's the dyer's polypore, Phaeola schweinitzii, really common. And if you see that growing next to your beloved Douglas fir tree in your yard, it's probably a butt rot going on. That thing is parasitic. Here's your lobster mushroom again. Talked about those already. The Pisolithus, or the dead man's foot, or the dog turd fungus. This one is a very crazy looking mushroom, but it can put off some really cool colors. And so check out this hat. Was given to me by a fan of my channel. This is all wool that was dyed with tons of different mushrooms, and it has mushrooms that are dyed with mushrooms. So cool. It's the coolest thing I ever got. And all done with different kinds of dyer's mushrooms. And it gives you something to do in the summertime because there's not a ton of good edibles out, but for some reason, all the dyer's mushrooms seem to grow in the summer. Cordyceps, we talked about that a little bit, the insect zombie fungus. And that show, The Last of Us on HBO, was based on if humans could get infected with a cordyceps-like fungus. But our temperatures run too hot for fungus. We run a 98.6, which kills most kinds of fungus, but not all. So fairy rings are created by fairies that are dancing in the middle of the night. And actually it's the mycelium growing from the center point outwards and then fruiting on the edge of its circular mycelium. That's how you get ringworms. It's kind of gross, but it's definitely a fungus. Up to 20% of the population may be infected by ringworm at any given time. It's just not fruiting. So it's here in this room with us, but it's not fruiting. It's not showing signs of itself. Athlete's foot. Another type of ringworm, and that's not an actual photo. If your foot looks like that, you need to go to the hospital right now. Some types of cheese depend on fungus, like Penicillium cambertii, Roquefortii, brie. That's all made with fungus. Your wine and your bread, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This one is another fungus that makes yeast possible. Penicillin in 1928, a chance event in Alexander Fleming's London laboratory changed the course of medicine when he discovered penicillin, but it wasn't like until 1941, one of his lab assistants, he couldn't find the right strain of fungus that he could grow and make it viable as a medicine. And his lab assistant was in a market one day and found a cantaloupe with this gold color frosting on it, and she took it back to him and said, "Is this what you're looking for?" And voila, that's where penicillin came from, and just totally revolutionized medicine as we know it. Now there's something called mycoremediation. Not going to go into this, but basically humans have done a lot of messing up of the earth, and we're trying to use fungus to help bring it back where there's a lot of heavy metals in the soil, petroleum products. A lot of fungi has been proven to get this stuff taken care of. So make sure to subscribe to my channel, Mushroom Wonderland. I think we're out of time, so thank you all very much.